Mosababu Toha is placed in memory of Edward Said. I am neither in nor out. I am in between. I am not part of anything. I am a shadow of something. At best, I am a thing that does not really exist. I am a weightless, a speck of time in Gaza, but I will remain where I am. Hello, dear guests, good evening. Welcome to the last part of today's program. Now we will present the novel of Aleksandar Hemon, The World and All That It Holds. In conversation with Aleksandar is John Freeman.
This is really interesting to look at a group of people in chairs and then a mob behind them, which I was hoping that the chairs were cleared, because as you may have heard, in addition to writing 4 novels, 2 story collections, and 2 books of nonfiction, Sasha has also, during the pandemic, turned himself into a poet. He has a book of poems forthcoming and is also releasing albums under the name Cielo Hemon. So at some point there may be music playing, which will be by him. But we're here
Saturday.
Saturday. There's going to be an event also in Bosnian in which he'll read in Bosnian and talk in Bosnian about this book. But because I only speak English, we're going to start with that. I'm going to just jump right in. This book, in addition to being a grand, sweeping novel set in history, a love story, it's also an incredibly rich novel about theology. And the last I checked, you were an atheist. I know that you're capable of love, and I know that you're skeptical of history as a narrative. How has someone who manages to be in the negative of 2 of those 3 create this book?
Dobro večer svima. Hvala vam što ste ovdje. Thank you for being here. Thank you, John. John is a very good and old friend. We have these things all the time, talking together on stage. And I like it every time. Just to reći na bosanskom, dakle u subotu ima na istom mjestu na bosanskom priredba gdje ću biti samo ja i čitam, i ako ima neko pitanje, odgovaramo na pitanja. Da se ne gužvamo previše. I onda će najviše da bude koncert Damira Imamovića, koji je, vjerovatno znate, snimio album koji je direktno vezan sa ovom knjigom, i kao dio koncerta ću ja da izađem i čitam odlomke iz knjige koji su vezani za pjesme sa albuma, tako će biti jedna kulturno-umjetnička priredba. In any case, back to your question, sorry. I spent almost at least 13 years, possibly 15 years, thinking and writing this book. And it's, at the beginning I decided it would not be about me at all in any way. And most of my books, other books, are not about me, but I took a lot from my experience, or from the experience of people I knew in Sarajevo or Bosnian diaspora, collecting stories and so on. But I thought I want to write a book in which there would be no autobiographical elements, direct autobiographical elements, repeating stories of employment, unemployment, and adjusting them for narrative purpose and all that. I wanted to make everything up from scratch. And so everything in the book, if you haven't read it, takes place between 1914 and 1949, between Sarajevo and Shanghai, with an epilogue in Jerusalem in 2001. And it was, I guess, a kind of an experiment where I would make everything up. Right? I read a lot of books on history. I did not make up historical events. The book starts with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Of course, I didn't make that up. It did happen. But everything around it, within that framework of historical events, I made everything up. And I wanted to, as a challenge, but also I wanted to be other people, right? Even when I was writing the so-called autobiographical stuff, at some point they would stop being like me. But still it was close. It was like, it was my brother or first cousin, the main character of the book, Pronek, or someone like that. And I wanted someone whose experience I would have to entirely imagine, right? So because I was not here for the assassination. I was not in the trenches of World War I. I did not cross the desert. I spent a month in Shanghai in a hotel, but I was not there under siege and so on. And so I wanted to put myself in a position where I would have to occupy the consciousness of one person, maybe more, but at least one, for a long time. And that person is Rafael Pinto. He's Sarajevan, a Sephard, who's a multilingual at the beginning of the book, who is, we find him as it were between two centuries, between the 19th and the 20th century. He thinks it's 20th century's history of progress, but it's not. And so his consciousness is in some ways similar to mine because he's diasporic, has multilingual consciousness, and also he has some poetic ambition and so on. But everything else I had to make up, right? And because, you know, his parents and grandparents, they're traditional compared to him. He was a Viennese student. He would have this argument, right, which would be partly theological, but partly an argument against the authority of the previous generations, including his father, right, who was a faithful person and who believed in God and had these arguments and punished Pinto for his sins. His main sin, quote unquote, is that he's a homosexual. And so I wanted to occupy that consciousness and think from within that consciousness, which is different from mine. And for this, the other thing that I decided, I had spent, as I said, a month in Shanghai, but I did not spend time in Galicia. I mean, I traveled around, but I did not do research on the front lines. In 1916, the Bosnian units fought in the Austro-Hungarian army in Galicia in the trenches against the Russians. And I did not spend time in Tashkent or Central Asia, not in the Fergana Valley. These are all places where the book takes place. And I did not cross the Xi'an, the western China, where the maltreating the Uyghurs, and did not cross the desert. And so I set out to imagine the whole thing. And this means not just the consciousness, but also what kind of stuff is growing in the Fergana Valley, what you know, flora and fauna. I had to look for things. So I read, this is partly why it took so long. I was reading books about things that I knew nothing about, like the flora in the desert, in the Fergana Valley, and the Shanghai gangs, and prostitutes, and all this. And I wanted to do that because it's a way to learn about the world. And I also read, to finally answer your question, a large number of pages of the Torah, the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, and also the Talmud, and then the comments on the Talmud, and stuff about the Kabbalah, and also the Quran. Again, I had read it before, and other things. And it's because I wanted this consciousness to have to be an agnostic consciousness, to have an argument with God, who created this world, which is not very good, and so on. And so it is my belief that fiction and art in general, but literature, particularly narrative arts, in fact, allow us to experience imaginatively the lives and consciousnesses of other people. And that, to me, it's not the only way that literature can do, but no other art can do it as well.
In many ways, the book is kind of two love stories conjoined. One is the aforementioned Jewish apothecary, Rafael Pinto, who we meet on page 1 in 1914, and his lover, Osman, who's a Muslim raconteur who he meets once they're conscripted into the Imperial Army in 1916 in Galicia. And we watch them arrow through this trajectory that Sasha just enumerated. Simultaneously, it's a kind of unrequited love story between Pinto and God, and that Pinto is asking God for love, and God is continuously saying no. And
nothing.
Or nothing. And the way those two are braided together is extraordinary. But I want to start with the flesh and blood love story, because it's warm, it's intimate, it's erotic, and you have in previous interviews described how you hate books which are written about history by looking at well-known, famous people. And I wonder what it means to look at history through a gay love story.
Well, you have to recover it because there are no stories as such, or at the very least they're not common. And in many ways they're totally absent. I mean, there are no stories from Bosnian history that are about two men or two women loving each other. It's totally absent. And it's totally probable, I mean, extremely probable that there were such love stories, that people loved each other, and that it's not a modern invention, obviously, same-sex love, that it always existed and always exists. But it's vanished from history. And to my mind, what literature can do is, you know, the grand historical narratives, they're all different kinds of history these days, but by and large, in the history of history, the stories were about great men, right? And usually great heterosexual men. Here and there would be a woman, but also a heterosexual woman. And so, you know, the leaders making difficult decisions. Lincoln or you know, Vladika Danilo or Churchill making some terrible decision that have to make and be so far above the people who are not capable of making such decisions, and then they make a decision that's a narrative, and there are movies about it, there are dramas about it, there are biographies about it, and so on. That's all well and nice. But I don't detest it, but I would never read a novel about a great man making an important decision at some historical moment. I cannot imagine a more boring thing. For one thing, it's always the same thing. You know, they frown and they think, oh, should I do this, should I do that? And to me, it is also that it's partly related to, you know, our Bosnian experience, right? That we've individually, people who are, unless they're making big decisions that affect lives of other people, their life and death, in fact, we are too small to be in history, right? We are nothings and nobodies. There's a story in the book, which is a Sarajevan story about, you know, I don't want to tell it now, but it's about nothings and nobodies. And so I think that what literature can do is recover the experience of nothings and nobodies, people who are forgotten by history, but we can reimagine their lives, because those are the lives that were lost. We know how many lives were lost here. We know how many lives are being lost in Gaza right now, right? People who are literally vanishing under the piles of rubble. They might never be recovered. Entirely families wiped out. Their stories are not recoverable. They will vanish from the history. They'll be telling stories about Netanyahu who's making a, you know, important, difficult decision to wipe out Gaza, and Biden making a difficult decision to support Netanyahu and blah, blah. And I mean, it's detestable in many ways, but also it's not particularly interesting. But what about the nothings and nobodies, right? Who tells their story? And in the 1916, when Pinto and Osman in Galicia, in the trenches, right? In June of 1916, there's a so-called Brusilov offensive, where the Russians break through the front, right? And destroy effectively the eastern front of the Austro-Hungarian, for the Austro-Hungarian and German troops, and push it west. But the thing is, 1 million soldiers died in that, right? 1 million soldiers, an unconscionable number. And who remembers those soldiers? Who remembers the Bosnian soldiers, for instance, who died there without a trace? Their bodies never recovered. They may or may not have received a letter from the imperial army that they perished. They're just gone. And to me, it is what literature can do, and, you know, other than narrative arts, perhaps the other one being really film or theater, is recover, or allow us to imagine those experiences, and therefore, in some ways, restoring not only the dignity and the value of those lives, but also, by extension, the lives of people like us. You know, it looks like I'm important here, but I'm no more important than anyone in this space, right? Anyone will never be, because I don't make decisions that affect other people's lives, right? It's the democracy of powerlessness involved in all this. All we can do is like and love each other, and you know, be nice to each other.
You alluded to the fact that this book took 13 to 15 years to write. I remember you going to Shanghai at least a dozen years ago.
In 2000, 25 years ago, 24 years ago.
And it was, and you were describing it then as a trip to research a novel about spies. And so this novel clearly changed as you wrote it, and also the world changed significantly. You know, you were, in the time that I've known you, you've had significant losses. You've left Chicago, which became a dear home to you. You've moved to Princeton to teach. You watched America flirt with and then fully embrace fascism. And I watched during that period as you struggled, I think, to try to warn people for what was coming in the language of experience of recent Bosnian history. And I watched you struggle with the fact that America was incapable of listening to that experience. And surely some of those things would have affected this novel. And I'm not asking you to psychologize why, but I'm curious in particular about the last, say, 6 years in America. I felt certainly a change in your engagement with politics. And how did that fall onto this novel, if you will?
Well, the novel was well on its way when, you know, the most recent wave of American descent into fascism and idiocy accelerated. And it was more specifically, it was the peak for me was the summer of 2020, the murder of George Floyd. You know, the people demonstrating on the street, police or just white vigilantes shooting in them. And all this happening in the course of the pandemic, and in Princeton, where I now live and teach, it was totally deserted. And it's like I was in the 6th floor looking around in a deserted landscape, including a golf course. And at some point around that time, I partly because I knew that it was coming, and then there was, of course, January 6th in 2021, right? When they charged at the Capitol, right? They tried to attempt a coup. And I had written a piece after I had, you know, railed on Twitter for a while, saying that the Trumpian and Republican right-wing agenda, the only thing there is aggression and conflict, right? They have no other plans, no other ambition, no other goals, but to accelerate conflict, right? There's not even pretense of some kind of different social order, not even just make America great again. It's total bullshit. It is just moving toward conflict. And I wrote a piece where I said this is going to end in conflict, in violence and blood, right? 6 months before that. And so on January 6th, when that happened, I was like, in one day, they called me from BBC and from the New York Times and from Face TV in Sarajevo and someone else, I can remember, because they asked me to comment on it because they said I predicted it, right? I don't think I predicted it. For one thing, it was so fucking obvious that to me it was just... But then what happened is that I realized I don't want to react. I want to act. And the only way I can act is by making stuff. And it was writing the book. I hadn't finished the book. And also I was making music. And it was... I made a conscious decision and totally stopped writing op-ed pieces, opinion pieces. I stopped giving interviews or commenting on things. And people were calling me for like 2 weeks on the phone from Sarajevo, from Europe, from everywhere. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? And it was partly because I thought, whatever I say is not going to change anything because, why would anyone listen to me, obviously, but also because the thing is so well on its course that it can't really be stopped. By me, certainly, in my opinions. But more importantly, I realized I have a very small amount of power in writing and making things. I have this limited talent that I live with. And all I can do in the world is make something that has not been in the world before I started making it. It's totally irrelevant. The music I make, no one listens to it, doesn't sell anything. It's not going to change anyone. But there's this sense of agency that I make decisions related to that, right? I'm not reacting to someone else's decisions. I'm not reacting to the decisions of fascists and Trumps and, you know, police or Israel. I'm not reacting. I mean, I feel it and have thoughts about it and I'm infuriated by it, but the only way I can do something in the world, to have a sense that I'm not totally passive and helpless, is to make something. And so it's my decision, and I own it. I don't think that everyone should do it. I don't think I'm better or worse, for that matter, than anyone else. But it's in that state of kind of moral, ethical, human panic, right, and despair, in fact, not panic. The only thing that could save my mind and my soul, it seemed, was that I just make stuff. And so that stuff I continue making. I don't, as I said, I don't think that everyone should be doing it, but we all cope with with it in some ways. And it's a long game. It's a long fight, right? It's been going on forever, certainly for Bosnians, against fascism and murderers and killers and racists and all that. So it is important to stay sane for as long as possible.
I don't know if this is true. I know you'll correct me, but I feel like in the moments of your greatest despair, when you've been creating, with not Love and Obstacles, but the Lazarus Project, which is a book in some ways in response to the Bush administration and its spectacles of violence and torture. You worked on that book in part with Weber, who added photographs in the middle of the death of Isabel, when you were writing My Lives, the Book of My Lives. You were working with other people, and you began to be interested again in your father's music from Ukraine. And when you were working on this book, out of nowhere, Osman and Pinto start singing to each other. And along the way, as you're writing this book, you reached out to your friend Dahmer to write songs to go with this book, and you began to send him chapters. And I don't want to say that music comes only in as a rescuing horseman to despair, but can you talk about when music enters your writing life? Because it seems not a new thing, it seems a continual thing.
Well, I mean, I have never been able to write without music. I mean, when I write, I listen to music. And there's no music, it's very difficult for me to write, or maybe 45 minutes or an hour if I don't have my headphones. I've written, hundreds of thousands of words with music. And there were stories and books in which certain pieces of music attach themselves to that. And that's the only two things I can listen to. There was a story I was writing, or maybe even a book, but the only two things that I listened to was Mothership Connection by Parliament and Mahler's Ninth Symphony. And this was a while ago, so there were these, a double-deck cassette tape, so it was continuous play. One of them ends, the other one immediately stops, and then I switched them. So like for weeks on end, it was death and funk. And then I would write a story, and there was a Chicago DJ who called herself Psycho Bitch, and I would write a story just Psycho Bitch beating in my ears. And it's totally random, right? It's not thematically connected, the music. It was never thematically connected to what I was listening to. This book, however, it all started, the very inception is really because there is a woman, and many of you know her or have heard of her, it's Flori Jagoda, right? She survived the Holocaust in Sarajevo. She was a Sarajevan. And in 1947 moved to the United States, right, and lived in Baltimore until a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, she died at the age of 96 something. And after she was still a young woman, so she raised a family and children and grandchildren. She sang to them songs of Sarajevo Sephardic Jews, right? And in the 80s, they talked into recording this, right? And she recorded an album called Memories of Sarajevo. And somehow I got a hold of that cassette tape in the 80s and 90s. And to me, they're beautiful songs. Many of them are kind of Sephardic standards like Anderletto and it's sing all across the Sephardic world, from Bosnia to Iraq. But also the way she pronounced some of those sounds, it was absolutely Sarajevan, and I just loved it. And I wrote about it even before the war and after the war. And so I wanted to write about Sarajevo Jews, right? That's the Sephardic Jews, and this kind of longing in her music. She she recorded another album, which was called Canticas de mi Nonna, the songs of my grandmother, where she sang songs that her grandmother sang to her. And to me, it is one of those things that if you are Bosnian or have a similar experience, I am constantly concerned with the vanishing of people and the experience and their stories and their music and all this. This whole project of literature in some ways, or art, is keeping that alive to some extent. And not necessarily nostalgically as a museum piece, but alive, right? And so the music was always essential to this whole project from the very beginning. Before it was even a project, it was there. So they were always going to sing to each other, Pinto and Osman. And of course, I like my techno and psycho bitch, but also I like Sevdah, right? It speaks to me like it speaks to all of us. And when I was younger, I was exclusive. I like techno. Sevdah is sentimental, but at some point, as I aged, I like the range of everything. I like my psycho bitch. I like the Canticas de mi Nonna and Sneak Padena Beharnavoch. And so I wanted all that music to be in the book. And so as I was writing it, it said one day, I just became entirely clear to me, the way it's clear to me that this is a bottle, that Damir should just record these songs. Because he's one of the greatest. He comes from a dynasty of Sevdak singers, right? And he also, very importantly, it's not a nostalgic thing, right? He's sort of updating it, making it modern, and recovering also LGBT experience in that music, and sort of both respecting the history, but also not worshiping the history, because it should be alive. And so I called him and said, how about we do this? And of course he said yes. And then he started, he's also a great researcher, a great scholar. And so he started researching and digging up the versions of Sephardic songs that were not recorded, not standard, right? Including some of the archival recordings from the 1910s and 1920s. And then picked the songs from the Sevdak tradition that would fit into that. And then wrote some songs that I then retroactively reinserted kind of anachronistically into the book. And the very title, which I always wanted to be the title, Bejturan ruža, the music is traditional, but the words were written by a Bosnian refugee in Sweden, right, who has written lyrics for Damir before. And so he wrote the song, sent me the demo. I developed a theme around it, reinserted the song, or inserted the song into this past, which didn't really entirely exist, to make the motif of the book. And the title in Bosnian is Bejturan ruža. In English, it couldn't be that, but I always wanted that to be, because Bejturan is pelin, which in English is wormwood. Crvljivo drvo, nikako to ne ide. So it wasn't going to work. So, and this was the working title. I just kept a file under this name, and I couldn't find the name. I couldn't use wormwood. Then I kept this title, and it's still pretty good.
There's so many things I want to ask you. It feels like, in a way, that you are using novels now to recreate the kind of, I sense in you, in all your activities, a longing for utopian group projects. And you've done this with soccer. You've done this with the way that you make music, and Semezden Medvedinovich's son is recording your videos. But and going back to this novel, the sort of utopian project at the heart of it is the love story. And I feel like there's two things happening here, because one is you're focusing on love as perhaps the only manageable utopia that we can do. And the second, there's one American in this book, I think there's one, who's a kind of slippery spy who turns up in Shanghai, who's sort of a joke. And in the last 5 or so years, or 10 maybe, as there's been an explosion of art in the U.S., not that it's been held down, but there's been a lot more capability to produce it. And even on work as popular as Crazy Rich Asians, there's like one token white character. And I feel like in this book you've decided, okay, there's one token American. And you've lived in America almost for 25 years or so. And I feel like you're turning your 30. And this book won the Grand Prix Literature Américaine in France. But it's kind of, I know that probably pleased you, because you could say, and there's just one. And I feel like those two things are possibly connected, that you're saying goodbye to America in a certain way. And you're basically saying, I'm not going to digest this experience for you. I'm going to write this novel. It's going to have 8 languages in it. One of them is Ladino, which is spoken by 18 people in America, including Hank Azaria.
Yeah, that's right.
He did, yes. Yeah. The guy who voices 6 characters in The Simpsons also speaks Ladino. That's how good an actor he is. But can you talk a little bit about that experience of basically making a polyglot novel in which the utopia is love, and also simultaneously turning your back on America, and how much you'll digest of what is going to be in the novel?
Well, before I even started writing it, I mean, I know it was 13 to 15 years, because in 2010, for some reason, I sold this book to my British publisher based on proposal, right? It had the same trajectory. They were going from Sarajevo to Shanghai because I had decided, and I can't remember how much before that I had decided that they would go east, and I also had decided there would be no Americans. This was I thought that whatever slim chances of commercial success I had, that I should kill that in America. And so when I was Freeman's partner of many years and is my agent and the dearest friend. And so when I was telling her about the book, and I was describing, so they go from Sarajevo to Galicia and then bad things happen, and they go from Galicia to Tashkent and then bad things happen, and then they go from Tashkent to Shanghai, bad things happen. And I wanted, because you have to put the name of the book in the contract, it has to have some kind of a name, and I didn't have any name. I suggested that the name for the contract would be Guaranteed Low Sales. And so my agent reasonably said, there's no fucking way, right? But her better idea was bad things happen. So in my contract with my British publisher, it was for the book called Bad Things Happen, right? So in that it was a 3 or 4 page outline, right? And it's exactly geographically as it is in the book. And there were no Americans, but they just go east. That's how I decided. Go east, there are no Americans, no west. There were 2 things changed. One is in the proposal, Pinto and Osman were friends. They were just going to go east together, and then they would long for Sarajevo, and as they were moving away from it and could not keep any contact with it because it's 1920s, no internet, no telephone, no letters, they would sort of they would remember it with such intense nostalgia, it would become a fantasy unto itself, and they would it become an imaginary city for them. And by the time they got to Shanghai, it would be entirely fantastic, like a mythological system. But somewhere, at some point, and I can't remember when and why, I decided that I'd rather have them be lovers. And only reconstructing this, but I don't remember this really, I thought that the value of love, narratively speaking, never mind humanly or ethically speaking, is that it's more complicated and complex. Where nostalgia, and we should know about this, it's a flat pitch, right? It's always the same tone. It could only get louder or less loud, but it's always the same tone. It's sort of retroactive utopia, or how well we lived. We went to the coast every year, right? And everyone just partied together, and we loved each other, and neighbors loved each other, and then suddenly it all went to hell. And so I understand this humanly, it's narratively extremely interesting. I've written books and stories about it, but for a book that goes from Sarajevo to Shanghai, I thought that would be a long time to spend with the same kind of sentiment. This is all a reconstruction, I don't remember any of this. But I thought if they love each other, it's more complex, and including the fact that you cannot have love without the body, right? There's no love. Maybe platonic love, but that cannot last for 30 years, right? And particularly if they're in the war, where the body, or in such historical circumstances, the body is constantly in danger. So you want to protect your body because you want to be alive, but also you want to protect the body of someone you love, because without that body, what's love, right? It becomes a kind of a fantasy or hallucinations, as it were. And so once I decided they would be lovers, then the shape of the book changed in some way. So the idea of the book, the ideology, in fact, of the book, because then it becomes a kind of it investigates the question, is that what are the limits of love? They go through terrible things, right? They at no point do they pass through anything that resembles a functioning society, other than the first, 10 pages. There are no hierarchies. There's no society. There are no doctors. Sometimes they have no place to sleep, right? And so, under what circumstances can love be sustained? What are the limits, right? What was the limit of love in Auschwitz? Were there love affairs in Auschwitz? What is look at Gaza now, right? Where the entire families are destroyed, and there's the intensity of destruction is so shocking, even if you've seen so much destruction in your life. Within that, their parents loving their children, and people, protecting each other in their lives. And so there's this great human capacity for love in the worst of circumstances. Obviously, the capacity for evil matches it in many ways. And so then it became a love story, right? in many ways. And as far as multilinguality of it as a way of moving away from America, there was another deliberate decision. So this is the first book I've written where the English language is not part of the world. There's no particular reason why this book should be in English other than the fact that I've been writing in English, right? In all the other books, the characters are in America and they have to live in English and they have to make mistakes in English. They have to learn English. They have, English-speaking friends or spouses or enemies or colleagues and all that. And so English is diegetic, as it were, to that world. But here, other than Henry Krantz, the aforementioned American, there's really no reason for English. And the reason, as I said, that Henry is in there, I had decided that there would be no Americans. But there's a scene in Shanghai when Pinto and a British spy get into the elevator, and it's one of those things, wonders of writing and having an imaginative mind. I was writing the scene where they go into the elevator, in a hotel in Shanghai. And who should be in the elevator, right? You have to I wanted someone else to be in the elevator. So it was an infinity of humanity who could be in the elevator. But somehow Henry Krantz showed up. And I've been writing long enough that I have to respect this moment where, there's this idea, let's see where it goes. And then Henry started his short life in the book, and he's the only American. He's a Princeton graduate too.
I mentioned and I alluded to your love of collaboration in some ways, and as your friend, I've watched myself, regurgitate sentences by Sasha Hemon in accident or because your ideas have influenced me, including the one which is powering this book to some degree. Your theory that Gilgamesh derived that migration is narration, that we can't migrate without narrating, and you've been living that your life, but you're showing these characters do that simultaneously. But I've watched you in the course of writing this book also be porously influenced by others, in particular Lana and Lily Wachowski. And you talk about radical queer love as if you watch the Matrix Quartet, of which Sasha wrote the fourth film with David and Lana, or Lily. Lana. Lana. Those films are about surviving a brutal, inhuman situation because you love. That's what defines Neo and what makes the whole world permissible and what makes Neo's magic possible. And I had the bizarre experience of sitting in my own house, and Sasha had come to visit, and Lana came over on her way to Berlin. And my girlfriend, aforementioned, is Sasha's agent, and she once turned James Brown down when he asked her to dance. And so she added to her negative capability as a dancer, because that night Lana talked for 3 hours about what raving meant to her and why she created this apocalyptic world in something that looked like a rave party. And then right before we were about to break up, an actor from the TV show Sense8, which Sasha also worked on, turned up. And he was full of beans, and he had some coffee. And he was like, let's go out, or maybe we should just stay here. And he produced, like almost out of his jacket, a little speaker. And it was like, and he started moving. And Lana was like, looked at me, and then looked at my partner and said, this is where I ask if you want to take the blue pill or the red pill. And then she asked if we could hold a rave. There's 8 of us in my apartment. And to my everlasting shame and admiration, my girlfriend said no.
Yeah.
But I tell that story.
It would have been a good rave, yeah. More people would have shown up, yeah.
But I watched that night. I thought, that was the night where I twigged, and I thought, Sasha has been really influenced by Lana's work and her idea of what love is and what collective love is in the capacity of a rave. And I guess I want you to maybe talk about that now, because I see some of that in this book, but in a very translated form.
Yes. I mean, her work for sure, their work, but also we became very close friends. And then before we started even working together, in fact, we started working together because we were very close friends. And part of the friendship was that we had similar ideas about the value of love and human connection, and the value of art, and sort of this sort of a gathering place like a rave where people enter the space and share experience imaginatively and otherwise. And also ideas about music and dance music as such, and so on. So this is, I was influenced working with Lana and David Mitchell too, who was also a mutual influence all circulating. But it was possible because we were already friends, right? Because I really had no film ambition. I was not knocking on producers' doors asking to write movies at all. I've worked with Jasmila, but it's also, she influenced me too. And Damir, her husband and producer, who was, an old friend. And so we, the first kind of queer narrative and movie that I wrote was with Jasmila, Love Island, right? Which also features music. It's full of music. I wrote lyrics for the music. And it ends with a dance where everyone dances. This was before I worked with Lana in any way, right? So it was all these, this is the beauty of human connection, right? You put out your things and thoughts and feelings in the world by way of art or just by being in the world, and then other people respond to it, and then you find a common way to relate to them in a common way. But if you're making stuff together, it's an entirely different level of connection, right? We can sit around and talk about it all night or talk with people. I have done that. That's beautiful too. But it's entirely different when you find a connection and then you make something out of it, right? And then there's this thing that is both a thing unto itself, but it's also a document, a monument of your connection with someone else. And so it is, Lana certainly influenced me, Jasmila influenced me, but this whole experience of collaborative work, because literature operates differently, right? You can say that language is inherently collaborative. No one makes up the language, right? And so you influence, if you say something to me and I remember what you said and I think about it 2 weeks later, right? That's influence. But there's something about being in the same space and then creating this thing like film that is material, right? It requires props, right? It requires people being in space, or theater for that matter. Selma Spahic, if I may say so, is working on an adaptation of this book in Bosnia, which should be ready in later this year. But this collaborative aspect, I discovered this by way of film, rediscovered it because I had done it in a band when I was very young, but I was younger and stupid and was not a very good musician, and still not. But this film experience where you start working with other people, I've written something by myself, but everything that has been produced, I've done with other people. And then you see then this work of 2 or 3 people, then growing and involving more people, the film crew, and then the actors come, right? And then the whole thing just becomes large, and then when you look at it, I don't see myself anywhere specifically, but I see myself all over it, right? I have a hard time saying, I wrote this, right? Even if I did, I can remember that I was assigned that scene, but it's never just mine. And then this collaborative, collective endeavor of art became so important to me that I kind of, it's not that I lost interest in literature, it's that I only really want to do literature if other people can be involved. And not theoretically and philosophically, in a sense that yes, we share language, yes, the reader is a collaborator, that's all well and nice, but I want to be in the same space with people I'm making stuff with, right? And so with Damir, we communicated. It was in the pandemic, right? Talked a lot, but we performed. We'll be performing on Saturday. I mean, he'll be performing. I'll just come out and read. But to be part of this creative energy that involves other people, it's an entirely different way of bonding. And dancing in a rave is similar. It is not because it's creative in many ways, but really the crucial thing is this experience of synchronous joy, where that joy with strangers, right? And that includes the film crew, because I know some of those people, right? But they're not my friends. But there's this, the works of collective creativity contain the joy of creation of that collective, ideally, right? Those are the best things. And the people remember it, and they love it, and they're proud of it, however much money it makes or doesn't make in the box office, that really becomes totally irrelevant. How much money Matrix 4 made or didn't make, or Sense8. I just loved being part of that. I still love it. And it was a formative experience, particularly Sense8, because I worked on that most intensely. It was the early experience. And so it kind of forced me to reconceptualize art in general, but even literature, as something that at least should strive toward this state of synchronous shared joy, that this is really what art is about, creating conditions and situation where people can bond through some experience of joy. Temporarily, it's not a basis for a state, let alone a nation state, and certainly not a basis for genocide, but bond in some kind of joy that is intense, beautiful, important, but it doesn't have to last forever, because it'll happen again, like a rave, right? You don't rave once in your life. You either rave or you don't rave.
I think I maybe raved just once. Then I
You
pulled a
missed your
muscle.
chance. You could have done it twice.
I know. Nicole had to get in the way. I'm going to open up to questions from you. I'm sure you have them for Sasha very shortly. You know, you've been talking about sort of synchronous joy, and you know, I in my mind's eye as a reader of you, you know, you've written 8 books now. You've written many columns, probably several other books that are published here, and so there's quite an arc of your style and what you've been doing. And I still think of stories like The Conductor, you know, which was in Love and Obstacles, as one of the greatest stories written in English in the last 50 years. And, you know, I think of that story in particular because so many of us, and I think of this in part because I've just had this conversation with Mossab, feel let down in this current moment, you know, by academics, by people that we looked up to. And I feel like in writing that story, you didn't exercise a memory, but you certainly dealt with some sort of feelings of an actual person. I know you've talked about this before. And you know, we've been talking about a book which is made up that goes off real events that begin in 1914, but pretty much from there on, it's you. It's you making up things and taking Osman and Pinto through this brutal trajectory, leavening it with songs and love, but it's brutal. But in the world that you and I will step back into once this event is over, there are these moments of being let down. And I want to talk to the Sasha who wrote The Conductor and just ask him for some advice for how to live in the world where the people we love, you know, or the people that taught us, the people who made our minds, are letting us down. And what you learned in that moment and how you recapitulated, you know, the world that you lived in and all that it held, and who you made friendships with.
I don't know what advice I can give you. I mean, you know, it's what happened here, what's happening in Gaza, what happens in Ukraine. At some point, it forces people into not just choosing a side, sometimes choosing a side, right? I had friends who chose the other side, and I chose this side, and we're no longer friends. But it was also painful because you start wondering, when did we start parting, right? Where there has to have been some kind of history. I had a professor, Nikola Korlevich, who was my favorite professor in college, and then turned out to be a fascist. And had he not shot himself, he would have been a war criminal, right? And so I was wondering, I'm still wondering, what was the turning point, right? Was he good and then became bad? Or my friend, I mean, I don't want to name them. Or was I stupid and could not see the fascist tendencies, right? But a moral disaster like genocide, right, or like war, forces people into revealing themselves in some ways that even if they're just tendencies. And what I've come to believe is that we all have tendencies, competing tendencies, that the range of humanity is like saints on one end and psychopaths on the other. But everyone in between is struggling to be a good person every day, right? And could be a beautiful human being to one person, to their family or whoever, and be a psychopath or cruel to someone else. But in a situation like this, was a large ethical events, as it were, like genocide and war. What is hard for people, and it's not as hard, but it's still very hard, if you have kind of had to make a similar decision yourself before, as Bosnians, many Bosnians had to. It is hard to sort out those feelings, right? It's hard to muddle it, because people rightly demand from you to declare where you stand. Do you think this is right or this is wrong? And a lot of your relationships, individually or collectively, hinge on that, right? Do you think this is right or this is wrong? Or do you think this is, if you think this is wrong, what do you think we must do now, right? What do you think we're going to do? And if you think there's nothing you can do, or that it's hard to do things, what is it? What is the direction, right? A situation like that demands answers, and one must declare oneself. Any kind of muddling, and kind of, or silence for that matter, is usually rightfully seen as complicity, right? But it forces people into conflict, and we all love to love, and I detest conflict. I avoid conflict my entire life with people I love or people I don't love. But it forces a conflict in some way, even in your head, right? I've had many imaginary arguments and fights with people I've never spoken to, or have spoken to, but not about that, because you have to define your ethics so as to be able to declare them, if need be, and you demand from others, implicitly, explicitly, to declare their ethics, to declare their moral stand. And for many Bosnians and Sarajevans, where we had gone through this in various ways, right? Because, I mean, I don't want to remind everyone to that. There was this whole kind of a muddy thing about Yugoslavia and preserving Yugoslavia, and whether, who was for Yugoslavia, who was against Yugoslavia, and they got slipped into all kinds of complicated issues. People were raised in Yugoslavia, but then Bosnia became dependent. It was not easy always to understand what was being lost and who was destroying it, right? And at some point it became absolutely and definitely clear. And if you could not declare yourself at that moment, then that was declaration unto itself, right? If you could not at some point say, this is genocide, this is wrong, this is attack on a sovereign country or on civilians, then you lost that ethical value. And what happens in my experience, or in my experience, in my being part of the larger experience, is that people, once they make that decision, they have a very hard time going back and saying, I'm wrong. They pursue the same thing, right? And so someone was telling me that they're all over Belgrade, there are graffiti and signs saying, we are not genocidal people. Ilana said, nismo genocidan narod, and she said, and I agree, if you have to say it, if you have to repeat the fucking thing, then maybe we should talk about it a little more. Yeah?
My final question is, I don't want to, in case anyone hasn't read this book, there's a hinge in the middle of the book-ish, and there's a reveal, there's something dramatic frame-wise that happens at the end. So I've been trying to avoid talking about these two things. But I think one thing I can say about Pinto and Osman's journey in relation to what you've just talked about, which is that Pinto and Osman are tumbling through one collapsed society after another, where there are no norms, there are no ethical standards, there's nothing that would be recognizable in a world that they had recently lived in. And one of the things I wonder about the book is whether it's saying to us, you may not be able to count on a place because it may not be there when you get back. You may not be able to count on governments because they're going to be destroyed. You may not be able to count on the essential good nature of people because clearly that's not the case. And you may be able to, if you're lucky, have love, and if you don't have love, maybe you have the memory of love. And I wonder if those two things, the love and the memory of love, are in operation in this book as not utopias, but as ways to say somewhat sane, so that if for example, the people that you adore, have let you down in this present moment, rather than saying everyone lets me down, you say these people I still love, and I can live within this world. And is that something that's happening on the page, that love and the memory of love are in concert?
Well, I think, the book is a refugee epic, is the way I describe it to myself and others. An epic form is one of the oldest narrative, if not the oldest narrative form in human history, because, as I was mentioning earlier, I have come to believe that migration results in narration, right? And before literacy, never mind before the internet, stories contain information, relevant information for survival. Because if someone leaves this, valley and goes over the hill to, I don't know, hunt for animals, when they come back, they would convey the information by way of a story, right? And sort of as a story as a causally related sequence of events. And so one of the things about this book is always clear to me is that it's an epic, right? And so the classic epic narratives like Gilgamesh, or the Odyssey, or Beowulf, or medieval romances, or Don Quixote, or Jack Kerouac, right? This basic structure is they move through space, episodically, as it were, and then in various episodes they encounter different challenges, and they survive them if the epic is to keep going. And then they have to have some special powers, the heroes, they're usually men, like Gilgamesh or Odysseus. They have some special heroic powers, right? So there's heroic epic things. Pinto's power is love, right? He's not a very capable warrior, and Osman is charming too, and he's also not a great warrior. But I wanted this kind of counter-epic that is also an epic, that he survives because he passes through these, not just ruined societies, but spaces that have not formed as societies at all, right? Functioning societies. They pass through the spaces in the East and through wars and the residual conflict after the wars. And the only thing, the only capability, the only power, the only superpower that Pinto has is his ability to love in the hardest of circumstances, which results in the survival of a little girl, among other things. And so, but also love cannot exist without the memory of love, right? Even if the person you love is with you still. There's a history of love that feeds into this moment. But if that person is absent, right, love does not stop. Without revealing too much, in researching this book, I read a series of books about kind of hallucinations, books about people who heard voices like Muhammad or Joan of Arc and had visions and so on. There's a long tradition of humanity. But also people who would continue communicating with people who were absent from their life, including by way of death. And so there's one thing that I read about, a study in the UK, I think, where it's 1/4 of widowed people over a certain age, let's say 75, in that study, would continue communicating with their deceased spouses after their death. And they did not from beyond the grave, not as ghosts, but they missed them so much, or so I understood, they would wash dishes together. Like I read a testimony by someone who remembered his dead wife, and he loved washing dishes with her still, or have tea together, because that memory of love, not just sort of the story of love, but the physical presence, because there's no love without the body, and the body also remembers, right? You miss the touch, you miss the smell, and all that. And so, one of the simple structural tricks that I did, that in each chapter, Pinto obsessively remembers something from the previous chapter. Not just from the previous life, before the first chapter, but something before the previous chapter. So this progression through space is like, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as it were. And that love is all he's got. And I think that love is beautiful, and there's a whole, discourse and history of literature and art about love, but it's also evolutionally necessary, right? We have survived as humans because we're capable of caring about other people. We're also horrible at killing other people, but we help people survive. And I read Last week, there was an article in The Guardian about a discovery of a Neanderthal bones, or of a Neanderthal child that probably had a Down syndrome and lived to the age of 6, which disputed the proposition that Neanderthals, this is before humans, mind you, were incapable of care, right? Because what was theorized before is that they would kill children who could not survive for the purpose of survival, right? But in their progression toward humanity, as well, the humans destroyed them and exterminated them. But part of human evolution was becoming more capable of love. And love that is not only utilitarian, not just for the purpose of reproduction, right, and extension of the species, but because it's a social bond. And it helps us be in the world. And so Pinto is that kind of a hero, right? Not a warrior, not a killer. He does offer Russian, but that was once. But he is capable of this thing, and not because he had an extraordinary childhood or had some kind of special talent. He's just, well, he woke up. He was brought in the world as someone capable of love.
I think that's the best possible place to end this conversation, and to open it up to you for questions for Sasha about this book, his other projects, love. He does give good advice on occasion. There's a joke I could make, but I'm not going to make it. Anyone have a question? I won't be able to see a hand, so you just might have to shout.
Throw a pebble at us. Do you have a question?
I went to a Quaker school. I can wait for the inner light.
No questions, no questions.
Yes.
Upali ovaj mikrofon. Aha, this one. This one.
Okay. Hvala na ovoj divnoj večeri. Imam jedno pitanje, jer se sjećam prije 7-8 godina da si u nekoj kolumni na Radio Sarajevu rekao da ćeš u slučaju da Trump pobjedi napustiti Ameriku. Sad se to izgleda ponovo dešava, ali mogu ti reći da mi je drago što si ostao tamo i što radiš svoj posao, ono što voliš, tako snažno i tako s puno ljubavi, da mi ostali imamo koristi od toga. Eto, samo toliko.
Pa hvala. Vjerujem da sam to napisao, ali naravno takva obećanja se nikad ne ispunjavaju, zato što je teško je napustiti život, kao što znamo, otprije ovaj život koji imaš da bi započeo negdje drugi. Međutim, ja sam ovih zadnjih godina dana u Berlinu, tako sam malo odmorio od Trumpa, tako sam spreman za nove borbe. Did you understand the question? We were talking about you, Freeman.
I heard the word Trump, so I figured that wasn't in the Trump question. I know we've been going for a while, so maybe the best thing to do is to say that Sasha will go out and sign books out and buy book. You've been a wonderful audience standing for as long as you have. It's been great talking to you, Sasha. Nice to see you, Esther.
Hvala, thank you.
Hvala.
Vidimo se u subotu.